afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Welcome to the Development Control and Regulatory Board, Thursday the 12th of March. It is 2 o'clock, so we'll start the meeting. I'd like to remind everyone present that this meeting will be broadcast live via the County Council website and will also be available for viewing on the County Council website after the meeting. Please turn your microphones on when you are speaking and turn them off when you're finished speaking. Thank you. Members of the committee today, Mrs. Fryer is substituting for Mr. Bentley. Mr. Richardson is substituting for Mrs. Richards. Mr. Kaufman is allegedly substituting for Mr. Gamble, but Mr. Kaufman can't make it apparently. So I don't think there's a replacement for Mr. Kaufman. Moving on then, item number 1 is minutes of the meeting held on the 13th of February 2020. Move. Moved and seconded, you. Thank you. All in favour? Thank you. Question time. No questions have been received, I understand. Is that correct, yeah?
That's correct.
Yeah, thank you. Number 3 is questions asked by members under standing orders. We haven't been asked for any member to ask a question on that. Number 4 is to advise of any other item which the chairman has decided to take as urgent elsewhere on the agenda. Well, I don't intend to do that. Declarations of interest. It's noted that all members who are also members of a parish, town, district or liaison committee will have a personal interest in those applications which relate to those areas covered by the authorities. Any further interest to declare? No, that looks like no then, Ewan. Thank you. Petitions. Ewan, any petitions?
No petitions received for this meeting.
Thank you.
Mr. Smith at the first Stamford Road, curving up slow to reduce the crowns of a red horse chestnut tree by 5 metres and reduce the height of 18 conifer trees by 50% to improve the light conditions to both the garden and the house. The proposed works will involve pruning the trees to exceed the 100mm diameter that is recommended in the British Standard 3998 tree work recommendations. Consequently, the cut surfaces of the branches and the stems are unlikely to grow protective callus. This will, in time, cause the exposed wood to become susceptible
to fungal decay. This decay will cause lateral branches around the decay pockets to become weakly attached and at risk of failure. The proposed works will also have a moderate detrimental impact on the amenity of the area. The recommendation is to refuse the crown reduction works for both the red horse chestnut and the 18 conifer trees. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Members, anyone want to say anything? Mr. Phillimore.
Thank you, Chair. So I guess the question, because they are substantial trees, especially the conifers. The question for me is twofold, I guess. One is, if they did lock those trees to their requirement, is there no surface dressing that can be given to the cut trunks to protect them from fungal attack? Or the second one is, rather than just a straight no, is there an opportunity to go back to the applicants and suggest that the crown is reduced by a lesser amount that would leave trunks and branches of a suitable size? Chair.
Mr. Shaw, can you?
Yes. The use of sealants on trees, on cut branches on trees, has found not to be effective and has been out of use probably for 25 years. Pruning conifer trees is difficult, because if you prune below the growing wood, they won't respond. It's not like broadleaf or deciduous trees where you can prune them and you then have buds that would then take over and grow suitable foliage. Conifer trees, unfortunately, don't do that. I've suggested to the applicant, Mr. Smith, that the conifers are thinned out progressively over a period of time to sort of produce shafts of light going into the property. This wouldn't have such an impact on the amenity of the area at all, and that the crown reduction, that the red horse chestnut could be crown reduced by about 2 metres, and that would be within the guidelines of the British standard.
Thank you. Mr. Phillimore.
So, if we were to put a slightly different recommendation on the table to match what you've just said, that would be okay.
Please, Mr. Shaw.
Unfortunately, because it's such a large change in the application, it would go from being a pruning operation to being a felling operation, and I think that I wouldn't recommend to the committee going down that line. The application for works to trees doesn't cost anything and is quite straightforward, so the applicant can put in a new application with relative ease. Also, they could appeal against this application, if you refuse it. So I think it wouldn't be unreasonable to ask for a new application to carry out the more or less the works that I've recommended in the report.
Thank you, Mr. Shaw. Mr. Gillard.
Move the recommendation, Chairman.
Seconder. Are you seconding that? Do you want to speak?
I don't mind, but I'd like to speak as well. if I may.
Do you want to speak, Tony?
No, moving on, accept
Oh,
Mr. Shaw's.
you speak now.
Thank you, Chairman. On page 12, I'll just look at the picture of the car and you sort of get the feel of the enormity of these trees. And they do grow really excessive. You hear them well over 100 feet plus. And I just wonder what the danger to life and people walking or driving along there if one day one of these damn things were blown over. It just seems that, I don't mean it to sound disrespectful, a bit reckless when it's so close to a road and a pavement where people walk along, that this thing is just growing and we're not going to touch it until nature takes it out of action completely. It just has a concern, because I know the dilemma that we're in with your suggestion that it should be, and I respect your knowledge on that, but it just looks a little bit worrying at that height, and if we're going to leave it, what's going to be the result in bad winds? And our weather's changed. We're having all these winds and gales. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Did you want to comment on that, Mr. Shaw, or can you?
I have inspected the trees and found that they were, from as much as I can tell, stable in the ground. The trees are quite a bit older than you would think. for their height because they've sort of suppressed each other. So they're only about 17 to 18 metres high. And that if there were signs that the root plates were unstable, well then that would be a different matter, and we'd be making a different recommendation, which would be to remove all the trees. But that wasn't the case when I inspected the site. The trees appear stable in the ground. Physiologically they're in good condition, the foliage is in good condition, they're not turning brown. So that the option of thinning them out, I think, is a realistic option, because the owner of the property, the applicant, wants to maintain some privacy to his garden. He doesn't want to get rid of them altogether.
Yeah. Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Chairman. I know Kirby Muxlow, and I know look at the next item, item 8, it seems to be all Kirby Muxlow on there. I'm just wondering, I don't know this road particularly well, what the rest of the houses are like round there. Are there a lot more trees of this type that it could set people wanting to chop down?
Mr. Crook. Any comments on?
Yes. I mean, part of the thinking behind this, the recommendation, is that the proposed works would exceed the British standard. We have very few standards in arboriculture, and it is one that the recommendations for tree work protects trees and guides against overcutting of trees because of the risk of decay entering the trees. So the reason why really this recommendation is being made is if consent had been given to reduce these conifers by a half, then there are probably another 10 or so properties just on this road here that would sort of think, well, maybe that's the right thing to do. So I think as a local authority we have to uphold the standards that we do have, and hence the recommendation.
Sean?
Yeah, I think reading paragraph 12, there is a way forward in all of this, with the applicant putting in a fresh application which avoids what this application would do, and that is to damage the trees. So I'm quite happy to support the recommendations, Chair.
Okay. Well, I've got to move. Do you want to second it?
Yeah, I already did that, Chair.
Did you?
Yeah.
You sure?
You asked me if I was.
Mr. Richardson.
Just very quickly, if I may, Mr. Chair, on page 12 in the photo, is that a street light at the end? The post that you can see? And if so, presumably it's a very ineffective street light, because presumably I can't see the top of it, so it must only be lighting the tree rather than the pavement. So I was wondering what the safety issues are there. And the second question is, are you able to tell me by what amount a red chestnut, so I'm not an expert on these things, would grow each year? So were no works to take place, you know, what height would it get to, how quickly?
Mr. Shaw?
Coming to the street light, yes, I noticed the street light was somewhat shaded by the trees, and minor pruning to clear the street light would be no problem at all, and would be done as part of a exempt works under the Highways Act. With regard to the red horse chestnut, it's reached its maturity size, and it's unlikely it would grow very much bigger than it is. When you cut trees, they respond by putting out more shoots. So if you did cut it by 5 metres, it would then just continue to grow. But if you cut it by 2 metres, it probably wouldn't do so much.
Okay, anybody else wish to speak on this item? I've got a mover and a seconder. If no one else to speak, we'll move to the vote then. All in favour of the recommendations? That looks to you pretty unanimous. Move on to item number 8 then. That's the delegation report on tree preservation orders and works done at trees. I don't think there's any point in particularly going through everything one by one. So if someone would like to move that, we receive and note the report. Which one? We're doing which? Maggie, right. Okay. All in favour? Thank you very much. Item number 9. Thank you, Mr. Shaw.
Thank you.
Item number 9 then is a variation of conditions at Cadeby Quarry, Brasscote Lane, Cadeby. And Nick, you're dealing with this. Would you present the report, please? Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Okay, so this application relates to Cadeby Quarry, and this site has been in operation as a sand and gravel quarry since 1964. 2 areas have been worked and completed, and that is the Manna Farm area, which is shown on the screen, and also an area to the south called the Southern Working Area, which is just north of Stapleton Lane. Both of those 2 areas are being restored. In fact, that's at an advanced stage, but those works aren't complete just yet. In 2017, planning permission was granted for an extension to the quarry on land which is known as the Jackson Working Area. Again, that's shown on the plan on the screen. That area is divided into 4 phases, which you can see on this slide. What happens is the mineral that's worked is transported internally to the main quarry infrastructure for processing, and which is shown with the star on the screen there now. The application relates to condition 7 on the 2017 planning permission for the Jackson Working Area, and that condition restricts part of this area, the area highlighted as phase 2A, from being worked until such time as the restoration works relating to phase 2B on the Manna Farm area are completed. And the only outstanding restoration works to the Manna Farm scheme are the soil replacement to the contour areas and also some hedgerow planting. Now, the applicant has advised us that bad weather has hindered the speed at which the restoration could be completed, which has basically pushed those works back to later on in this year. So the applicant has requested, as part of this application, an extension to the restoration timescales to allow the soil replacement to be completed by the 30th of June and to allow the hedgerow planting to be completed by the 31st of December. And you'll see from the report that these timescales are achievable and realistic in our view, and that the reasons for the delays, the bad weather in particular, has represented an appropriate justification for the works not having already completed. Now, all planning conditions that we apply need to satisfy various legal tests, and these are set out in paragraph 18 of the report. We've had a look at the original condition 7 on the planning permission, and it's considered that the requirement to restrict restoration on the adjacent phase to an unrelated phase elsewhere in the quarry is not necessary or relevant, and therefore in our opinion doesn't satisfy the legal tests, and that's set out in paragraph 55 of the MPPF. So the restoration of the Manna Farm area is being closely monitored, and there's every indication that the soil regrading and hedgerow planting work will be completed in line with the timescales that the applicant has indicated. It's made clear to the applicant that if it's not completed in accordance with the condition that's already in place, then obviously we could consider enforcement action. Just a few photographs to show you. So this is the phase 2A works in the Jackson area. That's next to the phase 2B. Just to give you an indication of what's happening on site. So you'll see from the report that we're happy to recommend that the planning permission be granted. There are conditions in place on the existing permission which could provide effective control, and we will be monitoring that site. We're recommending that permission be granted, but subject to different wording than what the applicant originally proposed, which will effectively allow for this land to be continued to be worked without hindering the restoration process on the adjacent site. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Nick. There is a recommendation on page 26. Open to members. Mr. Crooks. Oh, yes, sorry, Mr. Crooks, I should have come to you first, as it's part of your division.
Thank you, Chairman. Half of this is in my ward division, and the other half is in Councillor Old's. The Manna Farm part is the part that's in my area. I'm concerned about this for the simple reason that it seems like they're very keen to dig things up but not keen to put things back. There are two issues in my division. The one on Manna Farm is a 106 order for a footway, which they originally agreed at the planning application to put in, and so far have been stalling on it. I've sent dozens of emails in on this particular issue. They first of all said they wanted to put in a shale path, but the county wanted a tarmac one, which the residents wanted. They then said there wasn't room, and we had a site visit, and they said it was proved there was if they cut the hedge back. Then they said there was telegraph poles in the road, 3 telegraph poles. We had a site visit again with the GPO, and they said they could work round the telegraph poles, and it just goes on and on. There's another issue which the county have been chasing for 5 or 6 years on the same area, but on the Bosworth Road site, which has been completed 5 or 6 years ago. They dug a tunnel under the road to put the conveyor belt in, and they've been stalling on putting that right as well. And it seems to me that they're coming to the end. This one that we're looking at now is about the last in this area, because there is no more sand and gravel being found in this area. Residents and the parish council are concerned that once they're finished and they move away, it's going to be difficult to get them back to attend to this tunnel and also to put this footway in. And I'm concerned as well that this council could end up with a big bill chasing it legally to try and get them to do these things. So personally, I would like to see this turned down. Thank you, Chair.
Okay. Anyone else wish to speak? Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Taking up the point by my fellow councillor, what grounds would this be refused on? Because we're talking about the Jackson area, and also because of the weather. I quite understand why you can't complete what they'd hoped to by June, considering they probably haven't been able to work on it for a good 2 or 3 months. So those are my questions, and other than that, I would like to propose we accept officer's recommendation.
Nick, can you?
Thank you, Chairman. Just responding to the comments raised, I do have some sympathy with Mr. Crook's points in relation to the works that have been ongoing. We have been in dialogue for over a period of time in order to resolve some of the outstanding matters, but in fairness to the applicant, there are genuine reasons why some of these delays have been caused. We have commitment from the applicant, and we meet with them regularly in order to resolve those issues. Some of them are legal issues and certain requirements to satisfy highway legislation, which is hindering some of the progress, in particular in relation to the footpath. But we are regularly in contact with the applicant and also our highways colleagues in order to resolve that. As I mentioned earlier, the reasons for the delays to the restoration works to the Manna Farm area relate to the bad weather, and specifically to do with that. There is no intention to delay restoration, and in fact it's in their interest to get those restoration works completed as quickly as possible. there's no reason to suggest that when these works are completed, the applicant wouldn't be prepared to complete those works. This is a reputable company, and I've every confidence that they will complete the works in accordance with the planning permission. I think that's everything that you've covered there. Thank you, Chair.
Tony?
Thank you, Chairman. I have some sympathy with Mr Crooks for his local knowledge. However, I don't see it as a material reason for refusal. Looking on page 23, 10, no objection, 11 and 12, no comment. So, Chairman, if it's been moved, I'll second the recommendation.
Mrs Wright?
It was just following on from what the officer said about binding commitments. How binding are those commitments? Because I'm hearing what Mr Crooks is saying, and I think I've been on the committee, and this application seems to be coming back and coming back and coming back. And I'm just wondering how binding are those commitments that we can actually enforce and that they will actually be done?
The conditions that are attached to the planning permission are the same as any other conditions. They're enforceable by us, the local, the Minerals Planning Authority, so we can take action against those. So they're binding insofar as if we want to take action, we can do, if we deem it to be expedient to take action. Clearly, we don't always do that. We try and resolve enforcement matters by negotiation. In this case, in the case, for instance, of the tunnel and the footpath, they are in breach of those conditions, but we're working with them to find a solution to that. There are good reasons why the footpath hasn't been put in. They're ready to go and ready to install the footpath, but because of the highway works that are needed and highway approvals that are needed, it's just a separate process to planning, that has just caused delay and hindered the speed at which that has been completed. So in that case, it's not expedient to take action because we wouldn't make any progress through the courts while that work, but those processes are being gone through. So they are binding. We'd have to make a judgment on the individual merits like we do with every breach of planning control.
Mr Crooks, you wanted to come back?
Yeah, thank you, Chairman. Just a bit more info on that. On both of those, the tunnel and the footpath, the latest information is that they've submitted a 278 application and they've not filled it in right. Their solicitors have done it wrong. Now, this is, somebody said it's a big company. This is a reputable company. You'd have thought they'd have been able to do something as simple as that. And that's what makes local residents think that they're stalling, basically. And this condition was put on that they couldn't work that particular piece of land to get them into gear in 2017. And twice they've run out of time to the 106 order requirement to install these things. And once this committee's granted permission, and the other time it was granted by officers because there was a change in the drainage requirements by the highways people. But it just seems to go on and on and on, you know, and I can only say that, you know, it's causing some concern locally. Thank you, Chair.
Mr Richardson?
Just really following up on what Nick said, so what timescale are you working to resolve these issues? Because it's all well and good having a dialogue, but if the dialogue doesn't result in anything, at what time will you enforce and take action to resolve this issue?
There's obviously different timescales for different elements of the breach. So, as Mr Crooks has just pointed out in relation to the footpath, there is a separate process going on with our highway colleagues. Although there are elements that the applicant needs to comply with, there are elements that we need to do as well. There's processes to be gone through. So we can't take action while there are elements of work that we need to do to conclude the section 278. And that can apply to other elements as well. So in relation to what we're considering today, which is the restoration of the Manna Farm area, we've agreed with and discussed the completion of the soil remodelling works to be done by the summer, by the end of June, and hedgerow planting by the end of the year, which is a reasonable time period taking into account weather conditions and the amount of work that's needed. If clearly that goes beyond that time period, we'll make a judgment about what the reasons are for that and whether therefore it's expedient to take action. And we would do that with any breach. We'd make that judgment about whether it's in our interest. Because ultimately, if this goes to court for prosecution, we would have to satisfy the court that we've behaved in a reasonable way. And if we haven't, we will fail to pay costs and be accountable.
Thank you, Nick. If we've all done with it, I've got a mover and a seconder to permit. But we'll vote on it, and all in favour of the recommendation to permit. Against, Mr. Crooks? Yep. That's carried then, has passed. Thank you. Item number 10, page 39. This is another variation of condition at, when I can find it, Lockington Quarry, Warren Hills Lane, Lockington. This is being presented by Oliver. Oliver, would you present the case, please?
Thank you, Chair. This application relates to the variation of conditions 5 and 57 of the existing planning permission for Lockington Quarry to allow amendments to the restoration scheme. Lockington Quarry lies to the east of the M1 motorway and to the north of the A453. The operations comprise the extraction of sand and gravel and the restoration to agriculture and nature conservation through the importation of inert materials for infilling. Operations at Lockington began in 1998 and an extension was granted in 2008. This slide shows the red line boundary of the extension area, which incorporates the original area as well. And it is the subject of the application under consideration today. This photograph shows an aerial image of the site from 2017, and within it you can see the original extraction area to the north here, and that also incorporates the current processing area, and then the current working area, which is to the south. You can also see the A453 to the southeast, and then the M1 motorway to the west of the site. This slide shows a recently updated OS map, and it shows the updated access arrangements to the quarry. And you can see that as part of the East Midlands Gateway development, a new road has been built along the western side of the quarry, and that's been built since the aerial photograph in the previous slide. The site is worked and restored on a phased basis. The most recent survey shows most of phases 1 to 7 as being restored or undergoing restoration. So that is these phases to the south and up round the northeastern side. Phases 8, 9 and 10 are currently active, and that's 3 phases in the centre of the northern portion of the site. Some photos. This slide shows a view from the new access road and looking south across the existing landfill area. This shows a view looking from the new access road looking north towards the processing plant and site office. This shows a view from the junction of Warren Lane and Radcliffe Lane looking east, and you can see the mineral conveyor and feed hopper in the background. This slide shows a view from Radcliffe Lane looking in a westerly direction over phase 10. And this slide shows a view from Long Lane looking northwest over phase 7. The existing restoration for the site is to agricultural land and nature conservation. It was designed in 2006 and has not been amended since it was initially approved. The restored agricultural land is to the south of the site. The nature conservation is to the north, and it includes lakes, tree planting, species-rich grassland and scattered scrub. The scheme also includes hedgerow planting and the permanent diversion of a footway and bridleway. This application seeks to vary the restoration scheme to allow a more linear boundary between phases 6 and 7, so that's along here, and this shows the more linear boundary. This takes account of a diversion of footpath L60 and would result in a reduction of water, grassland and tree planting. It also looks to provide a more linear boundary in phases 8 and 9. And in lieu of these reductions in grassland, it looks to provide a comparable area of lowland meadow, which amounts to approximately 2.4 hectares to the south of the former lagoons in phase 1. So that's a creation of lowland meadow in this area here. And this would replace an area that is currently due to be restored to agriculture. The proposed restoration scheme also takes into account the East Midlands Gateway development, which extends into the western area of the scheme, the currently approved restoration scheme. No objections have been received from any statutory or technical consultees, and no representations have been received from the public. The proposed revised restoration for the site maintains an acceptable balance for the overall site in terms of nature conservation, habitat creation and agricultural land restoration, whilst enhancing the rights-of-way network. Overall, the proposal is in accordance with the development plan, particularly policies DM5, DM10 and DM12 of the Leicestershire Minerals and Waste Local Plan, which relate to landscape impact, public rights-of-way and restoration, aftercare and after use. It's recommended that planning permission is granted subject to the conditions set out in the report appendix. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Oliver. Is there any comments from Mr. Pendleton? Ewan?
I've not received any comments from Mr. Pendleton, no.
Okay. Open to members then. Anybody want to say anything, propose anything?
Move the recommendation.
Oh, thank you, Mr. Charles. Seconded by Mrs. Wright. Any comments? No? All in favour then? This will be about unanimous, I think, Ewan. Thank you. Item 11 then is I'll get there in a moment. Menorca Surface Mine, Bosworth Road, Measham. There is an extra paper which everyone's been circulated with. Well, they are on the Conservative side anyway. I don't know what's happened to the rest. I'm sure Mr. Crooks and Sean have, well, Sean have given it through himself, I suppose, but there's only one on. Oliver, please, would you?
Thank you, Chair. This application relates to the variation of conditions attached to the planning permission for the Menorca Surface mine. The proposed variations are to allow an alternative restoration option. The former Menorca Surface mine is located in northwest Leicestershire between the villages of Measham and Swepston, the boundaries of which are located approximately 350 metres to the west and 750 metres to the east of the application site respectively. The site is bordered to the north by Swepston Road and to the south by Bosworth Road. Notable features include the Gill Wiscore Brook, which flows through the centre of the site, there, and it flows into the River Mease, which is approximately 1.6 kilometres to the southwest of the site. The brook is designated as a site of special scientific interest and is part of the River Mease Special Area of Conservation. Bridleway Q33 also runs through the centre of the site, and it links Swepston Road to Bosworth Road. Footpath 057 runs parallel to the bridleway along the eastern boundary of the site and also links the two roads together. In terms of background, the County Council resolved to grant planning permission in June 2011 for the extraction of coal and fire clay, with restoration to agriculture, woodland and nature conservation. The permission allowed for 5 years of extraction, and the first coal was extracted in October 2012. The permission was subsequently varied in 2013, and it is this varied permission that is the subject of this application today. The site has been worked and fully restored as of June 2017, and it is in its second year of aftercare. It is of note that some elements of the aftercare requirements remain outstanding, and these relate to fencing, drainage, the planting of trees and hedgerow, and the creation of public rights of way. It's also of note that planning permission was granted for an extension to the mine, which included the demolition of farmhouse and agricultural buildings. And that's there's a notch to the north, and that's where the extended area was the subject of. That is subject to a separate permission, which is not sought to be varied by the application being considered today. The National Forest Company is seeking to purchase a portion of the site which lies to the east of Gilwiscore Brook. This piece of land was not previously worked as part of the former mine, but was used as an overburden storage area. The parcel of land is approximately 80 hectares and comprises agriculture, habitats retained along the brook, hay meadow and wet woodland. The application seeks to allow an amended restoration scheme to be an option for the eastern half of the land, and that's the area that the National Forest Company intend to purchase. The proposed restoration scheme would include a publicly accessible woodland, parkland, the incorporation of the existing public rights of way which cross the site, the creation of new public rights of way, and the formation of a network of permissive paths. It's proposed to increase the woodland created on the site from 5 hectares to 30 hectares when compared to the currently approved restoration scheme. This is a photo showing a view of the existing site from the southeastern corner of the application site, looking north towards Swepston Road. And this photo shows a view of the hay meadow looking east towards Winswood, and you can just about see Winswood in the background. Woodland tree planting and parkland is proposed across both of these areas just shown. In order to achieve the proposed restoration scheme, the application seeks to vary conditions 3, 71, 74 and 88 of the existing planning permission. These conditions relate to the restoration scheme, tree and shrub mixes, and the aftercare of the restored site. The proposed amended conditions allow the option to either implement the already approved restoration scheme or to implement that put forward by the National Forest. This approach allows the Minerals Planning Authority to pursue the outstanding elements of the existing restoration in the event that the National Forest does not purchase the land. In addition, by allowing the proposed woodland scheme to remain an option rather than a requirement, this would allow the National Forest to secure the grant funding that is necessary to deliver the scheme. The key policy is DM12 of the Leicestershire Minerals and Waste Local Plan, which relates to restoration, aftercare and after use. This policy supports proposals which include a mosaic of priority habitats and seeks to attain a significant net gain in biodiversity, and the proposed alternative restoration scheme fully accords with this policy. There's no objections to the proposed amended restoration scheme from any consultees, and no public representations have been received. Attached to the existing planning permission is a Section 106 legal agreement which secures the restoration of the site in accordance with a habitat management plan, the dedication of public rights of way, vehicle routing, the convening of a liaison committee, the transfer of the winter water storage lake to the County Council in the future, and the community fund and restoration bond monies. It's proposed that the legal agreement be amended to allow the alternative proposed restoration scheme, but the requirements relating to public rights of way, the liaison committee and aftercare bond and its release would remain unaltered. With regard to the aftercare management, enhancement and maintenance of the site, it's proposed that this is secured by condition for the land to the east of Gilwiscore Brook rather than legal agreement, as is the case at present. These details are set out in paragraphs 96 to 100 of the main report, as updated by the addendum report circulated earlier today. In reviewing the planning permission, the opportunity has also been taken to remove unnecessary conditions relating to the working of the quarry, which are no longer necessary, such as conditions relating to blasting or noise. It's noted that since the publication of the main report, officers' attention has been drawn to some minor errors in the proposed conditions, and the addendum report also sets out the updated conditions. Overall, the proposed alternative restoration scheme would not have any material adverse impacts and represents a biodiversity net gain, including appropriate priority habitats. The development accords with the relevant planning policy, and the recommendation is that planning permission is granted subject to a legal agreement. Thank you.
Oh, thank you, Oliver. Very good report. I think this site's coming together quite nicely now. It's going to look a lot better when it's finished than it did before they started with it. Mrs. Fryer.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the report. I'm very interested to see on page 75 and 76 the proposed revised numbers and species to take account of the larger area. It's most important that we plant and get as many trees as possible, and looking at the picture, it seemed a very benefit of trees anyway, but it is a good mix, and looking at it from an environmental part of view and for flora and fauna, for birds and insects, there's such a good mix there, and also on the other side with lots of other interesting things. So therefore I would like to propose acceptance of officers' recommendation, subject to the conditions as stated.
Yeah. Dan.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As one of two councillors affected by this, obviously Councillor Sheehan's the other affected member. No doubt he'll want to speak. I welcome this. I've had nobody say anything adverse. Ironically, I haven't had people queuing up to say what a wonderful idea it is. But truly, when they sit on their hands, it's a fair indication to me that, because my phone rings if there's a problem or a discontent. But looking at the whole detail, I really welcome this. The National Forest involvement in this will really open up a fresh new amenity for the area involved. I think it's first class, and it's already been proposed, but I will second it. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Sean, you're the other member.
Yeah, it is more Dan's patch than mine, this one, because I think you're that side of the river, but I do actually agree pretty much with everything he said. This is a great improvement, perfectly acceptable to me for the National Forest to come in and restore the land to their liking. We've seen them do an awful lot of good elsewhere in the area, and I think this is going to be another great amenity, as Dan has said. So, yeah, very much to be welcome. And also thank the officers for working through the objections that there were and dealing with those, and getting to the point where we are now that everybody seems to be happy. So thank you very much. So, yeah, I'll have to support it, Chair.
Okay, Mr. Crooks.
Thank you, Chair. I obviously support this, especially tree planting. We seem to be trying to chop them down all the while just lately. And I like to see the spread of the different types of trees that's being recommended to be put in. And also the addition that the National Forest is going to take up part of the land to plant up as well. Do we know any idea how many trees we're talking about on these two lists? It gives you a percentage, but it doesn't tell you numbers.
The short answer is no, we don't have an exact number of trees that will be planted, and I think it will probably depend on the exact topography as planting takes place. But in terms of hectareage, the current proposal, the currently approved restoration scheme is for 5 hectares, and this would represent 30 hectares. So it's a significant increase over and above what is currently approved.
Thank you. There's no more comments. It's been moved and seconded by Mrs. Fry, seconded by Councillor Harrison, that we permit. All in favour? Sorry? Yeah, carry on.
Not being an arborealist in the slightest, these proposed specimen trees, are they all of the latest sort of variants of disease resistant, drought resistant, water resistant, or water is the sort of latest generation of what's appropriate for us?
I think with the proposal being put forward by the National Forest, I think we can be fairly safe in the assumption that the appropriate trees will be used. But I think it's worth also highlighting that alongside the National Forest, there's been significant involvement and very close working relationship with both the Environment Agency and Natural England to ensure that the species mix is appropriate from a landscape point of view, a habitat point of view for species, and the protection of the triple SI and the special area of conservation as well.
Okay, we'll try and vote again then. Tony?
I'm voting.
Oh, that's lucky. That looks to be pretty unanimous, Ewan. Thank you. Item number 12 then is Orchard Primary School, Grange Drive, Castle Darlington. Nick, you're dealing with this one, aren't you? Would you present the report, please?
Yes, thank you, Chair. Yeah, this is an application for a foundation block extension to Orchard Primary School and to increase the car parking area. The foundation block provides classrooms for children up to 5 years of age, and if approved, it would increase the capacity from 45 to 60 pupils. This is intended to satisfy a projected increase in pupils from the September 2020 school year. There's sufficient capacity elsewhere in the school, so as those younger children move through the age groups, that could be accommodated without further extensions. Now, this is intended to be a permanent extension, and it's highlighted, you can see just on the plan. A permanent extension that would effectively allow and cater for additional future growth, but the intention is after the first year that wouldn't necessarily be needed immediately. The classroom would measure 40 square metres and be approximately 3.2 metres high. And there are some elevations, so it's a flat roof structure, just a slight gradual slope, mono pitch. The actual materials will be agreed by planning condition, so that will be agreed separately. The scheme proposes to increase staff numbers by 1 member of staff. There is a proposal to enlarge the car parking area to provide 4 additional spaces. That's partly to accommodate the additional staff member and partly to alleviate pressure for car parking in the area. They're also proposing 11 additional cycle parking bays and also to increase the fencing just around the car parking area. The development will result in the loss of 6 trees. That includes a birch, a field maple and some apple trees. The site is constrained, but it has good tree cover across the site, and we're not recommending additional planting in this particular instance. We've received 1 letter of objection. Residents concerned about the proximity of the construction access and the construction works to their property. You'll see we've got conditions forming part of the recommendation to limit the times when deliveries can take place, but also when construction works can be carried out, and to make sure that the construction techniques don't cause concerns to residential amenity. We're content that the impact on local residents, the nearest ones are here to the north, wouldn't be significant. There'd be no overlooking. The building's of a low profile, so it wouldn't be overbearing in terms of scale. And on that basis, subject to the conditions in the report, we're recommending that permission be granted. Thank you.
Thank you, Nick. Is there anything from Mr. Pendleton on this one, you?
No, I've not received any comments from Mr. Pendleton.
No. Okay. Dan?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As a former councillor for 4 years for Castle Donington, there's been massive development up there, and I'm not surprised that this application arrives as it does. I was a councillor for Park Ward, where a lot of the new development was taking place. So there's been a lot of new properties developed. So this is only natural and appropriate and apportionment to the evolution of the school and the development of that neighbourhood. So if it's been proposed, I'd be very happy to second it, Mr. Chairman.
I think it was half proposed. I'm not sure. Do you want to say the other half, Tony? Or?
I'll move both halves if you want.
Go on then.
Yeah, I'll move it.
You're seconding that. Yeah. Okay. Any more comments? No. So move and seconded then. All in favour? Yeah. Thank you very much. That looks to be unanimous as well. Item number 13 then is the deregulation paper. I did mention it to members last month, the last meeting in the meeting. Nick, would you present this report and go through tell us a little about what's being proposed?
Yes, thank you, Chair. I'll talk you through this report. So, the Development Control Regulatory Board has powers to vary the scheme of delegation that it has. So this report is seeking your agreement to amend the scheme of delegation for those matters that are brought to you for consideration. So this relates to a commitment from the Director of Law and Governance to undertake a full review of delegated powers in order to make sure that they're fit for purpose, up to date, comply with current legislation and good practice. And delegations are being reviewed across the council, and those of you who sit on other committees will be aware that there have been other changes that have been proposed and considered at recent meetings. So it's part of a wider review. The last time planning matters were reviewed was 2011, so it's been a considerable period of time. There's been changes to national planning policy and also to various changes to legislation since that time. And also in terms of keeping up with good practice and what other authorities are doing is also important. So there's a number of drivers for this, which is why we're bringing this to you today. So just some of the headlines. I won't go through every detail of the report, but happy to take questions. But some of the headlines in terms of what's proposed are on the slide there. The intention of what Development Control Regulatory Board deals with is those most complex and sensitive matters, and that's the same for all planning committees across the country. The more routine matters generally get dealt with delegated by officers. So it's those sensitive, more complex matters are the issues which generally are dealt with by boards, committees across the country. We're suggesting that the existing right for an elected member to request that the board determines an application is unaltered. That's been in place since for many years, certainly since 2011. We're not proposing any changes to that, so whatever changes we're suggesting to you, that position will remain as existing. So at the moment there are a number of clauses within the scheme of delegation where we're proposing modest changes in order to deal with the issues which I've just raised. So, for instance, there is at the moment a requirement where we have even just one objection from a local resident, and the item we've just considered in relation to the primary school is one typical example where that would trigger a report to the board. We're proposing that increases to more than 4 objections. That's more consistent with what other authorities do. And the reason for that is because when it becomes a higher number of objections, it becomes more controversial, more sensitive, and something that we feel is a reasonable level of objections to trigger that referral to the board. We're recommending that non-material changes are delegated, so these are very minor alterations to planning applications. At the moment they come to you. We're recommending that the ability to vary conditions be delegated. So at the moment those matters recorded section 73, we tend to bring a lot of those to you, and there were several on the agenda this time. So in some circumstances where they're not sensitive or complex in nature, they could now be dealt with delegated if you were to agree with the recommendation. We're suggesting to you that environmental impact assessment applications all come to DCRB. And that replaces, at the moment we have a clause in there where if the site is over half a hectare or a footprint of a building is over 1,000 square metres, they automatically get brought. But they're not always contentious. Now remember an application we had, for instance, the Desford Brickworks application that was just over 1,000 square metres. It wasn't visible from outside the site, no objections, but we had to bring that to the board, and I don't recall there being much discussion at that particular meeting. But it was one, because of the size of it, it had to come to the board, and that meant several weeks delays and a lot more work to prepare for the board meeting, which didn't necessarily need to happen. So what we're saying is, so while the larger schemes would still come, they're generally the ones that are subject to environmental impact assessment. So they're such as quarry extensions, big waste sites, the larger, more complex applications, and quite often also a lot of the variation of conditions will have environmental impact with them as well. So they would generally come, the bigger ones, the more complex ones. We're saying that enforcement matters be delegated. At the moment they all would come to the board. We don't have a lot of those, but the key point there is that enforcement, we need to be able to react and deal with things quickly. We often get criticism that perhaps don't respond as quick as we should do. We're proposing they're dealt with delegated. Generally members agree we need to take action. Doesn't generally get pushed back in terms of it being a sensitive matter from that perspective. The penultimate point on the slide there is that non-substantial changes or conditions following DCRB decisions. So, for instance, if DCRB recommend a series of conditions and we need to make a minor change, it might be something that's an error in the drafting, or it might be something that the applicant picks up. Provided that's not something substantial, then that will be delegated. Generally, we would discuss that with the chair and make sure that is a comfortable change. If it is more than minor, obviously we'll bring that back to the board. And finally, we're recommending the power to deal with applications for works to protected trees. So we had one today. So that will be a delegated decision, which again is consistent with most other authorities, certainly ones that I've worked with. It's rare that you have TPO applications come to a board unless a member referral comes in. So you'll be aware in terms of your local constituents, if there's a objection or concerns raised, you could request that comes to board in the normal way, but if it's not, then obviously it'll be delegated. So I don't propose necessarily to go through every single word. The appendix sets out the detail, and the right-hand column sets out the reasons for the suggested changes. More than happy to take any questions. Thank you, Chair.
Okay, Sean, Mr. Richardson, Michael.
I think it's important where we're transferring powers in this way, and it says only a relatively modest change, but nevertheless we need to recognise that there is a transfer of powers within this, that the calling rights that we enjoy as members are preserved, to give it the necessary check and balance, so that if we're not happy with something we can bring it before the committee in the usual way. And I think it's good to see that there's some recognition in the report in paragraph 12 to acknowledge the impact it could have on a neighbouring division, and therefore local member is not just interpreted in the narrow way as the patch member, it's the local member, which could mean somebody just over the boundary. And I think it's useful as well to have an assurance that officers will give the benefit of the doubt on that in determining whether it's appropriate to notify a neighbouring member. So to notify them in any event, and clearly if they have a genuine concern about that, they can call it in. I'd also give notice of an amendment, which I'll talk about once it's been moved and seconded, Chairman. So I'll pause at that point and then come back later.
Okay, Mr. Richardson.
Just a couple of things, Mr. Chairman. Page 111, second bullet point. I think you meant to say officers, because it's going to be difficult for an office to give permission. I wouldn't normally query it, but as it's a proposal. My other questions are, of today's reports, how many of them would not have gone to this committee, because that brings it to life. And the bit I didn't quite understand was page 114, bullet point 5. We say all applications that require a 106 agreement to be referred to the DCRB. But then on page 116, we say clarification that delegation be given to negotiate, agree and complete 106 agreements related to the parish district council plan applications, subject to consultation with a relevant lead member. So one bit that's saying all 106s are going to this committee, and the other bit saying that none of them are going to this committee. So I couldn't quite understand what the amendments were there, because they're conflicting. Also, it doesn't actually state what you do is what's the process if the lead member is unavailable for a considerable period of time? Who does it get referred to if the amendment goes through?
Nick,
I'll try and pick up on all those questions. So, yeah, the difference between 114 and 116, first of all, this is a Section 106 agreement. So, the difference between the two delegations is one relates to where we secure Section 106 agreements with the district councils. So this is the item on page 116, where we request some infrastructure through a planning application consultation with a district. That this clarifies that the delegation, which it sits with DCRB, but the delegation would be to officers to negotiate and complete that in consultation with the lead member. And that in practice has been typically how it does. We don't generally bring reports here to do that, so that's just clarifying the wording of how that works. The other one on page 114, that relates to clarifying that all planning applications, the county matter applications, so minerals, waste, regulation 3, that require a Section 106 agreement, they would all come here. So that's to provide some distinction in terms of the complexity. All those generally are complex. We want all those to be dealt with by the board. At the moment, we have the criteria in relation to the size of the site, and it doesn't necessarily mean that they're complex. It just means that they're large in scale. But this is a way of defining the complexity of what is proposed, and that's why that clause is now in there. So the environmental impact assessment is one level of complexity. Section 106 is another level. It's another catch-all in terms of how we define the complexity of a particular application, as well as obviously having the member referral points. You're looking blanks. I'm sure you'll come back to me on that in a moment. But yeah, I was trying to remember what the other points were. Sorry, you have to remind me what the other point was, Mr. Richardson.
How many of today's reports would not come?
Yeah. So certainly. 2 applications would not have come. So the Orchard Primary School received just 1 objection. If that had been more than 4, that would have come, or if there was a member referral, it would have come. But provided none of those elements applied, that wouldn't have been brought. And certainly Mr. Shaw's application there for the tree wouldn't have come either, because they hadn't received the requisite number of objections, and I'm pretty sure there wasn't a member request in that case. So certainly those 2. Certainly the Menorca one would have come. I'd have to look at the detail of the other one, but yeah, it's the bigger one, the more complex ones.
Yeah. I suppose my point being is that as members, we know that the biggest risk, or one of the biggest risks facing this council, is 106 funding not coming through, particularly on large-scale developments. The council has recently set up an economic growth unit at the cost of £500,000 to actually look at these, and therefore it seems that one of the biggest areas of threats to this council will only be seen by one elected member going forward, which will be the lead member, which just strikes me from a public point of view of perception as, is it the right way to go?
Yeah, if I could come back and, yeah, that's helpful feedback. This has been something that we have been considering in detail, and we're very much aware of that as an issue. So the new growth unit has been set up, and there'll be a team of people working in that, and that's part of the money, £500,000 that you've referred to, will pay for some of the staff. There's also money going to be applied to create a new planning obligations team, so there'll be a series of officers dealing specifically with Section 106 matters, so there'll be teams in staff in 2 different teams that deal with that. In parallel with that, we are proposing various changes to how both officers and, importantly, most importantly, members are able to not only see what decisions are made, but influence that process. So, for instance, as well as the lead member, there will be at times reports to this board, which hasn't happened in the past, whether that's an information report or whether it's a decision making. So that's still to be worked through. It depends on the sensitivity of it. There could potentially be reports to cabinets in certain circumstances and in the most sensitive cases, but that's not for decision making, that's more for information purposes. And certainly at officer level, there is a growth steering group that's set up that would sort of guide and direct that, and that's in addition to the lead member, where that consultation will be carried out. Mr. Cross probably wants to add a little bit in terms of that.
Yep,
So.
Anthony,
Yes, thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, members. Just briefly from me, just a reminder that all matters delegated to officers, we have to consider when we're dealing with a delegated authority whether the circumstances are such that even with a delegated authority, it ought to come to a member-level decision. And that's a requirement on officers to weigh it up. So there may be some circumstances where, irrespective of delegation, might be felt to bring the matter to this committee for review.
yeah.
I mean, I fully understand that, and this is no, this is no criticism of officers doing anything wrong or otherwise. This trust to me is down to democratic accountability of this council in the eyes of the public for the people they vote in to exercise that democratic accountability on their behalf. And therefore I accept what Nick says, and my logic would have been is that had all that been documented and accounted for, it would be sensible to do these amendments after that actual process is put in place so members understand what that process might be.
Michael.
Thank you, Chair. Yeah, I mean, a lot of the stuff in here, common sense, straightforward, sensible. On page 114 at the top, two applications today, the school and the tree. I mean, I know at district level, an advertisement goes on lamppost adjacent to the proposed site where the application is. Does that happen in every case with the county? Because that's the sort of thing that stimulates objections or support. So while I'm not opposed to raising it to 4 objections, as long as it's advertised in a way where anybody adjacent to the site at least can see it and have their say whether they support it or object, that's important. We get a weekly list of planning applications as we do at district, we get it here. Is that all the applications that have come in, or is that a selection? I imagine it, I'd hope it's all that are relevant to each district. And then, I probably should know this, I've been here long enough, do we have a planning portal here where we can look at every application and rights of way thing and all the stuff that would come before this board? I mean, I can look at every application at Oby and Wigston relatively easy. Do we have that facility here? If we don't, it would make life a lot easier and we could understand it and let delegation happen because we've already got the information. So if you could answer those points, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm going to bring my colleague in just in a moment to answer the point about publicity. I'm pretty sure what I know he'll say, but he'll confirm that for me. Just in terms of the website, yes, we do publicise all our planning applications, whether that be any application submitted, trees as well as applications to us. So that's all on our website. It's all searchable by a number of criteria. So it's all publicly accessible in exactly the same way as the districts provide that. So there's no difference at all from that point of view. Oliver, do you want to clarify the situation with publicity?
Yeah, in terms of publicity, the level of publicity that's required is set out in regulation. So it's the Development Management Procedure Order, and there are minimum requirements. For the most minor applications, the minimum requirements are to either put up a site notice or to send letters to the neighbouring properties, and the level of publicity goes up depending on the scale of the application. So for EIA applications, there's a requirement to also put a notice in the press, as there is for all major applications, and all minerals and waste applications are major. So most of our applications are also advertised in the press as well. The level of publicity on the ground, so site notices, that's at the professional judgment of officers that are handling the planning application, but they will look at the areas that may be affected, so the routes of vehicles or nearest neighbouring properties or public rights of way to identify the locations that people are most likely to see the site notices. And in almost all cases, we'll take a belt and braces approach and use site notices and neighbour notification letters to go above and beyond the requirements of the Development Management Procedure Order.
Just come back, so taking the school one we had earlier as a case in point, all the adjacent properties were notified and there was a site notice.
I believe in that case there will have been multiple site notices, and then the neighbouring properties closest to the extension were notified.
Okay. Anyone else? Do you want to, just this, in the briefing meeting, there was just a additional words that might be added to page 114, the 3. Sean, do you want to just...
If I can help, Chairman, I'll formally second it and then move the amendment. I think realising that you need 5 objections now to bring something to committee, residents may decide to raise a petition. There is an unfortunate tendency amongst some planning authorities to treat a petition as one objection. Thankfully, that's not the case here. At least I don't think it is. But just to avoid any doubt whatsoever, if we can add the words either individually or via a petition between the words objections and from on the top of page 114, that's paragraph F, small 3, so that it reads more than 4 objections, either individually or via a petition from local residents and or businesses, etc., etc. So we recognise that putting your name to a petition counts as one objection. So if you've got 10, 15, 100 names on there, that's how many objections are recognised, not the one, which some authorities would take it as. So it makes it clear then to residents as they're raising a petition that that's not going to get treated as one and just brushed aside. It's important to do that. So I'll formally move that as an amendment.
Okay. Well, to make it simple then, I'll move that from the chair. Does anybody like to second it? Anyone? No? Thank you, Maggie. Okay. Now do we...
So you'll need to vote. There's an amendment, proposal and amendment, and second. There's no need to go to the vote on that.
Okay. We'll move to the vote then. All in favour? Amendment.
No, it's not an amendment. Can I just clarify? Sorry. It's a proposal. It's not been amended because there was nothing on the table to begin with. So Mr. Coxon is proposing that the officer's recommendation is approved, subject to the amendment
of the words.
Okay. Mr. Sheehan has seconded that. So now you're voting on that proposal.
Okay. All clear? Very good. I think that's pretty unanimous then. Now we've got item 14, Chairman's announcements. I've none to announce, I'm afraid. And item 15 is any other items the Chairman has decided to take as urgent. I haven't any of those either. Thank you very much for coming. I'll close the meeting.